of two of Verdi's early operas, Nabucco by the English National Opera North and Ernani by Welsh National Opera. Another, Stephelio, is to be broadcast here on Radio 3 this Saturday. So it seemed appropriate to devote a programme to Verdi's early operas and discover in them some of the seeds of his later masterpieces. And this afternoon, John Steane does just that. He begins with music from Verdi's second opera, Un giorno di regno.
The opening chorus of Verdi's second opera, Un giorno di regno. Fresh and melodious, yet simple, perhaps almost naive. Not much, one might think, to tell the Milanese public of 1840 that here was the century's great composer of Italian opera, the master whose career would culminate some 50 years later with Otello and Falstaff. Certainly the audience didn't think much of it at La Scala on that first night, which also, if it happened, turned out to be its last night there. They booed and whistled and jeered. And to Verdi himself, it came as the climax of a bitter period of misfortune. The death of his daughter in 1838 and of his son in 1839. Then he himself had an attack of angina, and in June 1840 his wife died. What dreadful conditions for the writing of a comic opera. And yet it is something of a miracle, and it does tell of great things to come from this man. For the opera is a sparkler, musically a delight as it now appears to us, able after all these years to listen to it in a complete recording that does it justice. And it's not impossible for us, wise after the event, to see the future composer of Falstaff in some of its pages. Let's hear a part of the sextet in Act 1, actually at this point it's a quintet, where the counterpointing of the voices is marvellously lively and effective. I'm not going to go into the story, but basically the situation here is your pair of lovers, soprano and tenor of course, managing briefly to be together while the attention of two tiresome baritones, who want to keep them apart, is diverted by yet a third baritone who's all on their side. The passion of the lovers, in this recording they're Jesse Norman and Jose Carreras, is expressed with an ardent rhythmic figure. And then comes a most lovely, yearning and rapturous melody, sung to the accompaniment of busy chatter between two of the baritones, and a further strand that can be picked out in the suspicious grumbling of the third.
per quanto miro il nemico è fuor di chi. Anche troppo s'avvicina il va, quando sento schiettate. Mi e sugli occhi ce la fa, e sugli occhi ce la fa.
From Act One of Verdi's second opera, Un giorno di Regno, the quintet that's later to broaden into a brilliantly sustained sextet. That kind of imaginative writing for ensemble, in which all the disparate elements find a voice, is going to reappear throughout Verdi's work, and the masterpieces of its kind will be the quartets from Rigoletto and Otello, and finally, and in a not entirely dissimilar dramatic situation, in Falstaff. Still, it's comedy, and in that respect it's off-centre in the main line of Verdi's development. Un giorno di Regno was, as I said, his second opera. The first had had a great success at La Scala the previous year, and from it we can follow the lines straight through the 10-year period, 1839 to 49, that we think of as early Verdi. Of course, until comparatively recently, it was a period that wasn't much thought of at all. Early Verdi at one time meant Rigoletto, Traviata and Trovatore, which came from the years 1851 to 53. Who had ever heard of I Masnadieri, I Due Foscari, or La Battaglia di Legnano? Who could even tell you the name of Verdi's first opera? One of the most exciting developments in music during the last 10 years or so has been the rediscovery, almost the renaissance, of these operas, partly from productions, largely through records. And of course the delight of it all has been to find how good they are and how interesting, in their own right, and not merely because they point forward to the Verdi we already knew. So, to Verdi's first opera, Oberto, Conte di San Bonifacio. Now this, as yet, isn't to be found in the record catalogues, but a few years ago, that admirable tenor, Carlo Bergonzi, embarked upon the considerable task of recording one aria at least from each of Verdi's operas, except one, as a matter of fact, and that was Stephelio. And this enterprising album of his starts with a solo from Oberto. The aria itself, Ciel Pietoso, is beautifully written, but more remarkable, I think, is the opening passage preceding this. The text might well have been set as broken declamatory recitative. Ciel che feci, ah, si fugga, oh Dio, heaven, what have I done, ah, let me fly, and so forth. Instead, the treatment is lyrical, and the sorrow it expresses is all the more touching. And though it's still sometimes said that Verdi in these early years had little interest in the orchestra, this short passage shows him quite aware of the possibilities for illustrative accompaniment. Thus, the weeping that the singer fancies he hears is suggested by the woodwind, and the murmur of the breeze, sussurro il vento, is lightly, unobtrusively illustrated by a murmuring among the violins.
Quel sangue ho macchiato il pranzo mio, dove sfondere ossia il carino, il mio rosso. Ah, si funga, oddio, chi piange, cantrai, sussurra il vento. Oh no! L'ultimo lamento del misero che muore del misero.
Of course, it's very simple, this passage from Verdi's Oberto, sung there by Carlo Bergonzi. And yet I just wonder whether a little echo or ghost of that first opera wasn't somewhere in the old man's mind when he wrote the last act of Otello. The suggestion comes through the sound of the wind that Desdemona hears in between her singing Sauce, the fall of a minor second again in the Willow Song. Whatever the naiveties of Alberto and Giorno di Regno, there was no mistaking the power of a great operatic composer in his next production, Nabucco. Here, in this extraordinary tale of the king Nebuchadnezzar, tyrant, madman and penitent, conqueror and then liberator of the Hebrews, Verdi found a subject quite outside the ordinary operatic conventions. The leading soprano, too, was no conventional figure, but a woman of appalling ruthlessness and willpower that distort her nobler humanity. The music written for this woman, Abigail, makes fearsome demands upon the voice, and the singer has to be willing to sacrifice careful beauty of tone in the interest of a forceful dramatic performance. Verdi seems to be striking out here in a direction which Donizetti was unwilling to take in Lucrezia Borgia or Bellini in Norma. The terror of the story also challenged him to write a fiercer, more turbulent kind of score. This passage from Nabucco shows an assurance in Verdi, a willingness in this third opera to take harmonic risks, to show the Hebrews, women, old men and Levites panic-stricken at the arrival of the furious king brandishing his blood-stained sword before the gates of the temple itself. It also shows how Verdi's interest could center on the chorus, as people with emotions, and here perhaps as representatives of all oppressed nations on earth. These were, of course, the years of the Risorgimento, and Verdi's own patriotism flamed as an inspiration to his countrymen in their own struggle. He tells, as we read in Fugain's biography, how when he first glanced at the libretto of Nabucco, his eye fell straight upon the chorus of the Hebrews in chains. Va pensiero, go my thoughts, greet the banks of the Jordan, O my country, so lovely and lost. This became the great success and the most famous number in the opera. Let's hear it now, and carry through to the end of the scene. The priest, Zakaria, enters. It's Nikolai Gyarov in this recording, and inspires the people to hopefulness through faith in their God. What fire speaks in the old man, they cry. And together they look to the time when their chains shall be severed, and when Babylon the Great is fallen.
solleva lamenti all'Eterno, o sorgente
The scene develops splendidly, but its glory is that famous chorus, Va Pensiero, which became perhaps more affectionately adopted by the Italian nation than anything Verdi was to write throughout his whole career. At his funeral, and I believe many years later at Toscanini's, the huge crowd broke out into it spontaneously, most moving demonstration. Melody is the hardest element in music to explain or describe, but the effectiveness of this one has something to do with its breadth, the slow 4/4, more like 12/8, the sense of a people sharing its grief in a melody that swings and comforts rather than groans or rebels. This is how it's moving. In later operas, Verdi introduced choruses that recall Va Pensiero. There's the Jerusalem chorus in I Lombardi, for instance. But though his art became ever more supple and assured, he never quite recaptured this particular note struck so early in his career in Nabucco. I'm tempted to leave the chronological order of the operas for a moment, however, just to hear the comparable number in Macbeth. Macbeth was written in 1847, 6 years after he completed Nabucco. In many ways, it's the work of a much more mature composer. It's the chorus of refugees in the fourth act that compares with the chorus in Nabucco, and in this, Verdi introduced a more explicit note of lamentation. You'll hear, too, how the role of the orchestra has grown. In modern performances of the opera, this chorus is almost always given in the deeply moving version he wrote for the revision in 1865. but in this recording, the Welsh National Opera Company performs the original setting, also a moving utterance, and I believe that this is the first time the early version has been put on record. The opportunities for the chorus in these early operas of Verdi provide no doubt one reason why they've been particularly popular with the Welsh National Company, whom we heard in that chorus of refugees from the original version of Macbeth. Actually, the current revival of Nabucco is not being given by them, but by English National Opera North, and the Welsh are still performing their highly successful production of the other early Verdi, now in repertory, Ernani. This also has some good choruses, but I want to look now at the arias and the characterization. Ernani follows I Lombardi. The dates go Nabucco, 1842, Lombardi, 1843, Ernani, 44. And the next opera, I Due Foscari, came out in the same year, so that we see how fluently Verdi was composing at this time. And the rate of composition went on like this, one opera or two each year, right up to the time of Trovatore in 1854. Ernani is in most ways a more conventional opera than Nabucco, but it marks a further stage in the flowering of Verdi's melodic genius. The hero and heroine are really pasteboard figures in the libretto, but the music makes them at least something more than that. More remarkably, Verdi looks after the baritone and bass, and gives to them some of his finest arias. Thus the bass in this opera, De Silva, terrible old man, vengeful and unforgiving, troubles us because he's been established as a human being early on. He's discovered his bride-to-be with, as it seems to him, two would-be seducers. And he sings of the unhappiness of an old man with a youthful heart, now brought to dishonour. I'm going back some years for my recording of this, to 1929 in fact, and the great Italian bass Ezio Pinza.
Mai perché il penetrale più sacro di mia magione, presso a lei che sposa esser dovrà d'un Silva, due seduttori io sorgo. Pensate ora, miei fidi cavalieri, sia ognun testimon del disonore, dell'onestà, e si reta al suo Signore. Infelice, se tuo credevi, si bella Dio immacolato, delle tuo crine fra le nevi, piomba invece il disonor. Oh, perché l'età del seno, giovine core, m'ha turbato, mi dovevan gli anni almeno mardigelo ancora il cor, mardigelo ancora il cor, mardigelo ancora il cor, mi doveva gli anni almeno, mardigelo, mardigelo ancora il cor, ancora il cor, mi doveva gli anni almeno, mardigelo ancora il cor.
The singer there in that recording from 1929 was Pinza, and I make no apologies for going back further still for one of the baritone arias from Ernani. After all, the singing is so important in these works. The voices must have real beauty, the line must be smooth and firm. In this next aria, the singer is on his own, unsupported by the orchestra, until the melody begins to broaden out towards the end. He must manage his voice like an instrument. He must ideally do as Giuseppe De Luca does in this ancient recording from the old pre-electrical days, in the aria O dei Verdi anni miei.
Troppo vi crede il nome mio farò. Ed vincitor ne sarò, il nome mio farò, il nome mio farò. Ed vincitor ne sarò, il nome mio
Giuseppe De Luca, in a recording more than 60 years old, and still, I think, a model of how such arias should be sung. The role is that of Don Carlos, who's to become the Emperor Charles V, and at the start of the opera he seems to be cast in the role of the villain. But in that solo he renounces the more irresponsible dreams of youth and determines upon generous action, the reward of which being that all combine to sing his praises in the big number of the opera. Let's hear a modern recording of this. The baritone is Mario Sereni, not quite a De Luca, but somewhere in the line from that great baritone. The marvellous thing here is how the young Verdi rises to the occasion, how creatively he works solo and ensemble together, and how the melody glows and swells to match the inspiration of the great moment.
Brame odore, sposi voi siate, amate ognor, a Carlo Magno sia gloria e
That was the finale to the third act of Ernani, and I hope that for you, as it certainly does for me, it whets the appetite to see the opera in the current much-praised production by the Welsh National Company. That's a particularly splendid moment, but the opera is full of fine melodious numbers. Mind, they are numbers. Each comes to its end, and there's a definite finish, a space for applause, no doubt. This is, or was, the Italian tradition, one for which I think, for whatever it's worth, there's more to be said than has been said for many a year. But it's a tradition which Verdi wished, little by little, step by step, to free himself from. It took him a whole lifetime, and only in the last two operas does each act move forward as a single entity without stopping. In Ernani, even in mid-duet, for instance, there's no mistaking where one part of it has come to an end. But in the operas that followed, Verdi developed much more feeling of continuity. It's in his very next opera, I Due Foscari, that there starts that series of duets for soprano and baritone, especially with the baritone as father or father figure, that are going to be so much at the emotional centre of many later operas, Louisa Miller, Rigoletto, Traviata and Simone Boccanegra, for instance. And in I Due Foscari, the duet form is managed with great skill in construction, so that one section moves into the next, and the emotions develop dramatically within a style that still conforms to the recognized pattern. For the quality of the music, perhaps this excerpt will show how little inferior it is to the later Verdi that has become so very much more famous. The singers there in that duet from the first act of I Due Foscari were Katia Ricciarelli and Piero Capuccilli. The duet is between Francesco, the Doge of Venice, and his daughter-in-law, and as I say, it's part of a finely sustained, deeply moving passage in the opera. It set a pattern, and I want to play one more example of these duets, this time between father and son in I Masnadieri. We've moved on a few years now to 1847. In between have come Giovanna d'Arco, that is Joan of Arc, Alzira, Attila, and the original version of Macbeth, from which we had the Refugees Chorus. In this passage from I Masnadieri, even though it clearly links back to Bellini, the great master of this yearning and yet heart-easing flow of melody, it also represents a great advance in maturity. I think Masnadieri is, musically at any rate, one of the best of all these early Verdi operas. It's been revived very recently after its long neglect, and I hope it'll be given again. Of course, in a sense, it's Verdi's British opera, in that its premiere was in London at Her Majesty's, with the Queen, Prince Albert and the Duke of Wellington in the audience, and a quarter of an hour's continuous applause for the conductor-composer. So I think we ought to have a special interest in it. Among its many fine things is this short scene in the last act. The father here, an old man, weak from long imprisonment, is now resting, having been freed by a stranger who, although he doesn't know it, is his son. Nor can the son reveal his identity to the old man. But he asks and receives his blessing. Here in this, how flexibly the text is set. Recitative always blossoming into the tenderest lyricism, and then in duet, how the voices overlap, and even the formal cadenza at the end is no showpiece, but a moving expression of great tenderness.
Mio figlio, lo confianti, ma non dica le tue mani, me sol castiga.
José Carreras and Ruggero Raimondi there, in that scene from I Masnadieri. Masnadieri was followed in 1848 by Il Corsaro, La Battaglia di Legnano and Louisa Miller in 1849, and then Stiffelio, 1850, and the last of the operas before the famous three, Rigoletto, Traviata and Trovatore. All of this, these 10 or 11 years of composition, have gone towards the fashioning of the art that can now start to produce masterpieces. The marvellous discovery of our last 10 years or so has been that they, these early operas, 15 of them altogether, are in themselves such a rich store. And they show most movingly the composer always growing, always learning, and gently pushing the frontiers forward. We see him begin to bind his material into an artistic unity by the modest, unobtrusive use of theme. We see him begin to loosen the formal structure of aria followed by cabaletta, and every number a separate end-stopped piece. We see how the expressiveness and often the lyricism of recitative all the time deepening, as is the interest of the orchestral parts. The skill in construction, dovetailing separate sections, increases steadily, and the emotional identity is ever more firmly established. Most marvellous of all is the unquenchable fount of melody that becomes bolder, more distinctive and inspired as the years of this period go by, instead of drying up with youth. In some ways, the culmination of this process is seen in Louisa Miller, which also sees Verdi starting out on a new path, towards a more intimate kind of opera. But Louisa Miller is by this time almost well known, and I want to end instead with something less familiar and perhaps more representative of this first period. La Battaglia di Legnano is another of these operas that it's been exciting recently to hear for the first time on records. It's very much a grand opera, an opera of great events long in the past, and with a massive concerted number for the grand finale. At the first performance in Rome, 1849, the whole of the last act was encored. It's only about 20 minutes long, but even so. The appeal to Italian patriotism was no doubt one reason. The Lombard League has triumphed over the invading German Emperor Barbarossa. The victory has cost the tenor hero his life, but he's able in his dying moments to reconcile the soprano heroine and her baritone husband. The festival Te Deum is heard from the church, and then our excerpt starts with the hero, inspired, singing of Italy saved, and everybody praying for the heavens to open and receive the fallen warrior. The music is perfectly straightforward and unashamed in its emotional appeal, and under the circumstances it's no wonder that the act had to be repeated in its native land and in its own time. The wonder and the tribute to Verdi on the threshold of the years of greatness is that in its present-day renaissance it speaks so powerfully to our hearts now.
The end of Verdi's opera La Battaglia di Legnano, in the recording conducted by Lamberto Gardelli with Katia Ricciarelli and Jose Carreras in the leading roles. And that's also the end of another in repertory. It was introduced by John Steane. The producer was Graham Sheffield.